At my grandson's 8th birthday party, my daughter's mother-in-law pointed her finger straight at my face in front of everyone and blamed me for breaking a $20,000 vase. Only a careless old man like you could destroy something this valuable. Before I could even respond, my own daughter screamed, "You will starve in this house until you apologize to my mother-in-law right now." I simply nodded and walked away. They thought I was weak. Thank you so much for being here with me today. Before we move forward, leave a comment with your town and country. I always love seeing where everyone is watching from. Just a gentle reminder, this story includes imaginative fictional elements, tailored for reflection and entertainment. Any resemblance to specific individuals or events is unintentional, but the wisdom within it is completely meaningful. I have spent 71 years learning that the things you love most are always the ones you carry the most carefully. That morning, I stood at the kitchen table with Margaret's vase in both hands, turning it slowly, the way I had done 100 times before, checking for cracks that were never there. It was a Tang Dynasty piece or so Eleanor had announced to anyone willing to listen from the moment she arrived. Setting it on the dining room sideboard, with the particular ceremony of a woman who needs everyone in the room to understand the value of what she has brought. She had told Victoria it was appraised at $20,000. She had said this twice, once at the door and once at the table, in the tone of a woman making sure the number had been heard and remembered by the right people. I had watched her place it and thought nothing of it beyond the ordinary thought that fragile things in crowded rooms are a combination that requires attention. "You're going to polish a hole in it, Grandpa?" Daniel was leaning against the doorframe in his pajamas. Both socks mismatched his dark hair, pressed flat on one side from sleep. He was 8 years old and built like I had been at that age, all elbows and quiet observation, the kind of child who noticed things adults assumed children missed. "Morning, buddy," I said. "Happy birthday." His face split into a grin that reminded me so sharply of his mother at that age that my chest pulled tight for a moment. "Grandma Eleanor brought a really old vase," he said, patting across the tile toward me. "Mom put it on the sideboard. It looks expensive." "It is apparently," I said, and he accepted this with the matter-of-fact nod of a child who has learned that adults attach large numbers to things he is not allowed to touch. For a few minutes, we stood together at that kitchen table in the early Columbus morning, the September light coming through the window above the sink at a low golden angle, and I thought that this was the thing about grandchildren that nobody warned you about. They gave you moments of pure, uncomplicated warmth, right in the middle of the difficult years, and the contrast was almost unbearable in the best possible way. I had moved into Victoria and Ethan's house on Clearfield Drive 2 years earlier, 8 months after Margaret's funeral. When the house on Dunmore Street had become less a home and more a museum, I was paying property taxes to maintain. Victoria had suggested it. She had stood in my kitchen on a Sunday afternoon with a cup of coffee and said, "Dad, we have the room and Daniel loves having you around. Just try it." I had tried it. 2 years later, I was still trying it, though the nature of what I was trying had shifted in ways I had not fully named yet. The room they gave me was on the 2nd floor, north-facing, small enough that my old work table took up half of it, but I had put Margaret's photographs on the wall and called it mine, and meant it. A man who has slept in a field camp during a February ice storm on the I-71 bridge project in 1979 does not require much from a room. He requires that it be his, Dad. Victoria appeared in the kitchen doorway in her robe hair already done, despite the fact that it was barely 7 in the morning, a clipboard in one hand, and her phone pressed between her ear and shoulder. She pointed at the vase, then at the dining room. "On the sideboard, please. Not the center of the table. Eleanor's doing the floral arrangement." "Good morning, Victoria," I said. She pressed her lips together, covered the phone with her palm. "Good morning, Dad. Can you just put it on the sideboard? The caterers need the table space." Then she was back on the phone, moving down the hallway, her voice dropping into the professional register she used when she did not want to be overheard. Daniel watched her go. His grin had faded by about 30%, the way a child's expression fades when they have registered something they cannot quite articulate. "Is Grandma Eleanor bringing Biscuit?" he asked. Biscuit was Eleanor Marsh's Persian cat, a 12-pound white animal with the temperament of a retired senator and the destructive capability of a small natural disaster. I had seen Biscuit clear an entire coffee table in one leap at Easter. I had watched him sit in the center of a linen tablecloth and refuse to move for 40 minutes, while 6 adults rearranged their dinner plans around him. Eleanor carried him to social functions, the way some women carried handbags, with the same practiced ease and the same complete absence of apology. "I expect so," I said carefully. Daniel looked at the vase. Then he looked at me. Then he looked at the vase again, with the solemn, systematic concern of an 8-year-old doing threat assessment. "Maybe we should put it somewhere higher up," he said. I looked at my grandson with the particular pride a man feels when a child he loves turns out to be smarter than the adults around him. "That," I said, "is an excellent idea." I found a spot on the upper shelf of the built-in bookcase in the dining room, above the level where a jumping cat could reasonably reach, and moved the vase there instead, adjusting it twice until it sat level. Eleanor had placed it on the sideboard without thinking twice about Biscuit, which told me either she had not considered the cat, or she had considered something else entirely. I pressed 2 fingers against the base out of the habit a careful man develops around things that belong to other people and cannot be replaced. The first guests arrived at 11. By noon, the living room was full of Ethan's colleagues and their wives, 2 of Victoria's friends from the firm, and the neighbors from across the street, whose names I had learned and forgotten twice. I had found a position near the window that offered a clear sightline to the bookcase shelf and a reasonable distance from the conversations I had nothing to add to, and I stayed there with a glass of iced tea and watched the room the way I had always watched rooms, carefully and without drawing attention to myself. 30 years as a structural engineer on state highway projects teaches you to read load-bearing conditions at a glance. Where the stress is accumulating, which joints are absorbing more than their design tolerance, which structure looks solid from the outside, but is working harder than it should be on the inside. I had applied that same eye to rooms and people for most of my adult life, and it had served me better than I could have predicted on the morning I first developed it. Eleanor Marsh arrived at 12:15. She came through the front door with Biscuit draped over her left arm, like a fur stole wearing a cream blazer, and the expression of a woman who had decided the party was for her benefit, and was pleased to find it adequately prepared. She was 68 years old, trim, carefully put together with the kind of social fluency that came from decades of practice, and the particular confidence of a woman who had never once doubted that she belonged in the center of any room she entered. "Walter," she said my name the way you say the name of a piece of furniture you have decided to tolerate for the sake of the room's overall composition. "You're looking well." "Eleanor," I said. "Thank you for coming." Biscuit turned his flat Persian face toward me and blinked once with the profound indifference of a creature who had never been required to pretend interest in anything. I watched Eleanor carry the cat through the living room, greeting guests with the warmth she never quite directed at me, stopping to adjust a flower arrangement on the hall table with a proprietorial confidence that reminded me she had been in this house far longer in the ways that mattered to her than I had. Victoria materialized at her mother-in-law's side within 30 seconds, her face shifting into the particular brightness she reserved for Eleanor's arrivals, and the 2 of them moved together toward the dining room in the synchronized way of women who had negotiated their dynamic so thoroughly that the negotiation itself had become invisible. I turned back to the window. The Columbus September light was still clean and specific, the kind of afternoon light that makes everything look more permanent than it is. I heard Daniel laugh from somewhere across the room, bright and sudden, and I found him near the bookcase talking to one of Ethan's colleagues, pointing up at the vase on the upper shelf with the proprietary pride of a child who had helped make a decision. I raised my glass slightly in his direction, though he did not see me. Then Eleanor set Biscuit down. She set him down on the dining room floor with the casual ease of someone releasing a dog in a yard, and Biscuit immediately began moving through the room with the slow, systematic curiosity of an animal conducting an inspection. I watched him wind between chair legs, pause to examine the hem of a woman's dress, then look up at the bookcase with the calculating attention of a creature who has identified a point of interest and is determining the most efficient route to it. My glass of iced tea went very still in my hand. Biscuit crouched. His hindquarters dropped. His tail moved once slowly like a metronome setting its tempo. Not the jump itself. Biscuit moved the way all cats move without announcement and without apology, but the sound that followed. A single sharp crack, the kind that a room full of people registers before they consciously understand what they have heard, followed by the particular cascading collapse of something irreplaceable meeting a hardwood floor in pieces. The room went quiet in the specific way. Rooms go quiet when something has just gone wrong, and nobody has yet decided whose fault it is. I was already moving toward the dining room when I heard Eleanor's voice rise above the silence. "Walter." She said my name the way a judge says guilty, not loud, not rushed. With the full, unhurried weight of a woman who had already decided the verdict before the evidence was presented, I stepped into the dining room doorway and saw what I already knew I would see. The upper shelf of this bookcase stood empty. On the floor below it, Eleanor's vase lay in 4 large pieces and a constellation of smaller ones, the pale celadon glaze catching the afternoon light in a way that made each fragment look like it was still trying to be beautiful. Biscuit sat on the dining room table 3 feet away, cleaning his left paw with the serene indifference of an animal who has never once been held accountable for anything. 23 people were looking at me. I knew the number because I counted them the way I had always counted things that mattered quickly and without appearing to. 23 people with their drinks paused halfway to their mouths, their conversations suspended, their eyes moving between the broken vase on the floor and the 71-year-old man standing in the doorway with his hands at his sides. "I was standing at the window," I said. My voice came out level. 30 years of presenting structural assessments to state highway boards in rooms full of people who wanted different answers than the ones I had brought them had given me the ability to keep my voice level when everything underneath it was anything but. "I heard it from across the room." "Of course you did." Eleanor stepped forward, and the way she moved told me everything about what was coming. She had the particular forward momentum of a woman executing a plan she had rehearsed, not in the frantic way of someone improvising, but in the smooth, inevitable way of someone arriving at a destination they had already visited in their mind. "You were the only one near that shelf, Walter." "Eleanor." I kept my voice even. Biscuit jumped from the floor. I watched him crouch before I walked in here. Several people in this room saw the same thing. I looked at the guests nearest the dining room. A woman in a green blouse near the hall table met my eyes, and then looked away down at her drink with the careful neutrality of someone who has decided that whatever is happening is not their situation to enter. The man beside her studied the ceiling molding with sudden, intense interest. Eleanor drew herself up to her full height, and something shifted in her expression, a hardening, a decision being made and immediately acted upon. And she pointed at me with one manicured finger and said in a voice pitched perfectly to carry across every conversation in that house, "Only a careless old man could ruin a child's birthday party this way. That vase was worth $20,000 and you have destroyed it." The words hit the room like a dropped tray, I felt the air pressure change the way it changes when a crowd shifts its collective attention. 23 people who had been carefully neutral one moment ago were now looking at me with something different in their faces, not certainty, but the uncomfortable willingness to be convinced that's available to people who don't know enough to resist it. My jaw tightened. My hands pressed flat against my thighs. Ethan appeared from the kitchen doorway, wiping his hands on a dish towel, his eyes moving rapidly from Eleanor to the broken vase to me. He was 44 years old, broad-shouldered, with the careful, managed expression of a man who had learned to read the temperature of a room before committing to a position in it. He looked at Eleanor. He looked at me. He said nothing, but the nothing he said landed on my side of the room with the specific weight of a man choosing not to intervene. Eleanor. Victoria's voice came from behind me. I turned, and the feeling that moved through my chest in that moment was not something I had a clean name for. It was the particular sensation of a man who has spent 42 years loving someone unconditionally and is about to discover what that love is worth when the conditions change. Victoria stood in the hallway with her arms crossed at her waist, her face arranged into the expression she used in professional settings when something had gone sideways and she needed to contain it before it spread. She looked at the broken vase. She looked at Eleanor. She looked at me. And then she said, "Dad, I think you need to apologize to Eleanor." The burning that moved through me in that moment started somewhere behind my sternum and spread outward with a slow, total completeness that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with the specific devastation of a thing you believed in turning out to be something else entirely. To Torden, I said, keeping my voice low enough that only she could hear it. I did not touch that vase. Biscuit jumped from the floor. You can ask Daniel. He and I discussed moving it to that shelf this morning specifically because of the cat. Dad. Her voice had the clipped final quality of a door being closed. This is not the time. Then when is the time? I asked. Because your mother-in-law just accused me of destroying a $20,000 piece in front of every person in this house, and the cat that actually knocked it over is sitting on your dining room table cleaning himself. Victoria's jaw tightened. She uncrossed her arms, smoothed the front of her blouse with both hands, a gesture. I recognized the same gesture she had made since she was 12 years old when she was preparing to say something she knew was going to cause damage and had decided to say it anyway. "Mom," she said. Addressing Eleanor, her voice lifting back to its social register, warm and carrying, "I will handle this. Please, everyone, let's give Daniel his cake. This is his birthday." The guests, grateful for a direction, began moving toward the living room, with the collective relief of people who have been given permission to stop witnessing something uncomfortable. Eleanor smoothed her blazer, nodded once at Victoria with the satisfaction of a woman whose plan had just executed itself precisely as designed, and turned away from me without another glance. Ethan followed her. The dining room emptied in under a minute. I stood in it alone with Margaret's vase in pieces on the floor around my feet, and Daniel stood in the archway across the room. Both hands pressed flat against the wall on either side of him. His birthday shirt wrinkled where he had been twisting the hem, his eyes fixed on me with an expression that was too old for an 8-year-old face. He opened his mouth. Then Victoria appeared behind him, her hand on his shoulder, steering him gently back toward the living room. "Come on, sweetheart," she said. "It's time for cake." Daniel looked back at me once over his shoulder as she moved him away. Victoria stopped in the archway. She did not look at the vase. She did not look at the floor. She looked at me with an expression I had never seen on my daughter's face before, something that was not cruelty exactly, but was adjacent to it, the expression of a woman who had made a calculation and arrived at a number she could live with. "We'll talk after the guests leave," she said. But Dad, you are going to apologize to Eleanor before this evening is over. The guests stayed for another 2 hours. I know because I counted those hours the same way I had counted the guests earlier, carefully from a distance without letting the counting show on my face. I had returned to my position near the living room window after Victoria steered Daniel toward his birthday cake, and I stood there with a fresh glass of iced tea I did not drink, and watched the party continue around me the way a river continues around a stone it has been flowing past for long enough that it no longer notices the stone is there. Eleanor held court near the fireplace. She laughed at the right moments, touched shoulders, refilled her own wine glass, with the ease of a woman entirely at home in a house that was not hers. Twice she glanced across the room at me with an expression I recognized from bridge inspections, the look of someone checking whether a structure they have already condemned is still standing. Ethan stayed near the bar cart, talking to two men from his office about something that made all three of them lean in and lower their voices. He caught my eye once, raised his glass a fraction of an inch in a gesture that could have meant acknowledgement or apology, or simply the muscle memory of a man who had been trained to perform social grace regardless of what he actually felt, and then someone touched his arm and pulled him back into the conversation. Daniel sat at the kitchen table with two of his school friends, working through a second piece of birthday cake, with the focused dedication of a child who has decided that dessert is the one part of this afternoon worth his full attention. He did not look at me again. I understood that his mother had said something to him between the dining room and the kitchen, and I was glad for it. Some things an 8-year-old should not have to hold. At 4:30, the guests began leaving in pairs. Victoria stood at the front door with her hostess smile fully operational, accepting compliments on the food and the flowers, and little Daniel's wonderful manners with the warm, practiced fluency of a woman who had been performing this particular role for long enough that the performance had become indistinguishable from the person. Eleanor was the last to leave. She paused at the door, Biscuit resettled on her left arm, and said something to Victoria in a low voice that made Victoria nod twice with her eyes cast slightly downward, the way she had nodded as a teenager when her mother corrected her. Then Eleanor looked past Victoria's shoulder at me standing in the hallway, and her expression arranged itself into something that resembled sympathy, the way a painted window resembles actual light. "Ah, Walter," she said, "I hope we can put this unpleasantness behind us." I looked at her steadily. "Good evening, Eleanor," I said. Her mouth tightened by a fraction. She left. Victoria closed the front door, turned the deadbolt, and stood with her back to me for a moment, with both hands pressed flat against the door, the way a person stands when they are deciding which version of themselves to turn around as. She turned around as the version I had been afraid of since the dining room. "Come with me," she said, and walked past me toward the study without checking to see if I followed. I followed. She closed the study door behind us. The room smelled like Ethan's coffee and old paper and the particular close warmth of a space that was used primarily for things people did not want, observed from the hallway. Victoria stood in the center of it, with her arms crossed her heels together, her chin lifted at the angle she had inherited from her mother and never once recognized in herself. "Dad," she said, "Eleanor is expecting an apology. Said Eleanor's cat destroyed Eleanor's own vase." I said, while I was standing 20 feet away, "I have nothing to apologize for. That's not the point." "Then what is the point, Victoria?" Her jaw worked. She pressed her lips together and breathed in through her nose with the slow, controlled deliberateness of a woman managing herself very carefully. "The point is that Eleanor is Ethan's mother. The point is that she is a guest in this house, and she is upset, and you standing here telling me what her cat did or did not do is not going to fix that." "I'm not trying to fix Eleanor's feelings," I said. "I'm telling you the truth about what happened. I know what happened, Dad." Her voice dropped and something in it changed, became quieter and more specific. The way a tool becomes more specific when it is being used for its actual purpose rather than its stated one. I know exactly what happened, but I am asking you as my father to do one thing tonight that makes this easier. The burning in my chest was immense and entirely contained. I had learned that particular skill in the same 30 years I had learned to keep my voice level, the ability to feel something completely and show none of it. You're asking me to say I did something I didn't do, I said. In front of your son. Something flickered across her face. There and gone in under a second, too fast to name with certainty. But I had been reading Victoria's face since the morning she was born, and what I saw in that fraction of a second was not anger and not righteousness, but something that lived further back behind both of those, something that looked, if I was being precise about it, like the expression of a person who knows they are wrong and has decided to continue anyway. She stepped closer. Her voice dropped further below the register that carried through doors. If you don't apologize to Eleanor tonight, she said, I want you to understand what that means for you in this house. Your meals, your laundry, the arrangements we've made. All of that runs on goodwill, Dad. Ethan's goodwill. My goodwill. And right now, that goodwill is in very short supply. She took one step closer, and when she spoke again, her voice had dropped to something I had never heard from her before, flat, deliberate, stripped of every performance. You will not eat a single meal in this house until you apologize to my mother-in-law. Do you understand me? Not one meal. She paused, and the pause had the specific weight of a woman who has said the worst thing and decided to mean it. And if you still can't be reasonable about this, then you can find somewhere else to live. I looked at my daughter. This woman I had driven to soccer practice and helped with calculus homework and danced with at her wedding in a rented tuxedo that was half an inch too short in the sleeves. I looked at her and I felt the full weight of what she had just said settle into my chest, like something structural giving way. I understand, I said. She studied my face for a moment, searching for something, then nodded once and opened the study door. I walked back down the hallway. I passed the dining room without looking at the floor where Margaret's vase had been. I climbed the stairs to my room, closed the door behind me, and sat down on the edge of the bed in the dark. Outside, I heard Ethan's voice from the kitchen, low and easy, asking Victoria if she wanted tea. I heard her say yes. I heard the ordinary domestic sound of a kettle being filled, and I sat in the dark above it and understood for the first time with complete and total clarity that something in this house had been broken long before Biscuit jumped. The kettle downstairs stopped whistling at 8:47. I know the exact time because I was sitting on the edge of my bed, facing the window, and the digital clock on the nightstand was the only light in the room, and I had nothing to do but watch the minutes change and listen to the house settle around me the way old houses do in the early fall. The joists contracting in the cooling air, the particular creak of the second stair from the top that I had been meaning to fix for 14 months and had never gotten around to because nobody had asked me to fix it, and I had learned slowly and then all at once that in this house, the things I offered without being asked were rarely the things that were wanted. I had put Margaret's photograph on the nightstand 2 years ago when I moved in. Not the formal one from our wedding where she was 26 and laughing at something the photographer had said her veil caught sideways by a October wind off Lake Erie. This one was from our kitchen on Dunmore Street a Tuesday morning in March. Margaret, at 63, in her blue robe with a coffee mug pressed against her cheek, squinting into the camera with the expression she wore when she was pretending to be annoyed and failing completely at it. I had taken it without asking. She had told me to delete it. I had kept it instead, and in the 4 years since she had been gone, I had spoken to it more than I had spoken to most living people. She did it on purpose, I told her. Eleanor, I mean. The way she set Biscuit down in that room without a second thought for her own vase, or maybe with every thought for it. The way she looked at me right after before the pieces had even stopped moving. I pressed both hands flat on my knees. My knuckles ached the way they always ached in September. The old joints objecting to the seasonal shift, the way they had been objecting since I turned 65, and my body began registering weather the way a barometer registers pressure. A woman who brings a $20,000 vase to a child's birthday party and then releases her cat in the same room has either made a very careless mistake or a very careful plan. And Eleanor Marsh does not make careless mistakes. My throat closed. I pressed the back of my hand against my mouth and breathed through my nose until the tightness receded enough to continue. Victoria knew. She looked at me in that dining room and she knew. And she chose Eleanor anyway. The clock changed to 9:15. Somewhere down the hall, I heard Daniel's bedroom door open and close the soft, irregular footsteps of a child navigating a dark hallway in socked feet. I recognized those footsteps the way I recognized most things about my grandson by the particular rhythm of them, unhurried and slightly lopsided, because he favored his left side when he was tired. The knock on my door was 4 soft raps, the same 4 raps he had been using since he was 5 years old, and had decided that knocking was a skill worth doing consistently. "Come in, Daniel," I said. He pushed the door open slowly, the way children push open doors when they are not entirely sure of their welcome. He was in his pajamas, the ones with the small rocket ships on them, that he had picked out himself at Target 2 months ago, and wore with the loyalty of a person who takes their clothing choices seriously. He was carrying a glass of water in both hands, with the focused, two-handed grip of someone transporting something they have been trusted with. "I brought you water," he said. "Mom says you should drink more water." "Your mom is right about that," I said. "Come sit with me." He crossed the room and settled onto the edge of the bed beside me, close enough that his shoulder pressed against my arm, and handed me the glass, with the careful transfer of a child completing a mission. I drank from it and set it on the nightstand next to Margaret's photograph. Daniel looked at the photograph. He always looked at it when he came to my room with the solemn attention he gave to things he considered important. "I saw Biscuit jump," he said. He was not looking at me. He was still looking at Margaret. "I saw him from the hallway. He went up the bookcase like steps. First the bottom shelf, then the middle one, then the top." My chest pulled tight. "I know you did, buddy. I should have said something." His voice was very small and carried the particular weight of a child who has been turning a thought over for hours and has finally decided to put it down somewhere. "When Grandma Eleanor started saying it was you, I should have said something." I looked at my grandson's profile, the sharp line of his jaw that was going to be his father's jaw someday, the lashes that were entirely his mother's. He was 8 years old, and he was sitting in the dark with me carrying a guilt that was not his to carry, and the love I felt for him in that moment was so complete and so fierce that it pressed against the inside of my ribs like something that needed more space than I had. "Daniel." I put my hand on his shoulder, firm and steady. "You are 8 years old. It was not your job to say something. That was the job of the adults in that room, and they made their choices. That has nothing to do with you." His chin trembled once. He steadied it with the visible effort of a boy who had decided he was too old to cry in front of people and was not quite there yet. "Is Grandpa going to be okay?" he asked. "Grandpa is going to be just fine," I said. "I promise you that." He leaned against my arm the way he had leaned against me since he could first sit upright with the complete and uncalculating trust of a child who has decided you are a safe place and has never once revised that assessment. We sat like that for a few minutes in the dark while the house breathed around us. "You should go to bed," I said finally. "It's past 9:30. He stood tugged at the hem of his rocket ship pajamas and paused at the door with one hand on the frame, looking back at me with an expression that was too careful for his age and too knowing for the birthday it had been. "Grandpa," Hugh said, "the vase isn't gone. It's just in pieces. You can fix pieces." I held his gaze across the dark room. My throat ached with a completeness that I refused to give a sound to. "Get some sleep, buddy," I said. He went. I sat with his words in the quiet for a long time, turning them the way I had turned Margaret's vase that morning, looking for the weight in them. The clock moved to 10:15, then 10:40. The house had gone completely still, the way houses go still when the people inside them have each retreated into their own separate darkness and stopped requiring anything from one another. Then at 11:03, I heard footsteps in the hallway that were not Daniel's, heavier, more deliberate, the particular cadence of someone who has been rehearsing a walk. 3 knocks at my door, spaced, controlled. I already knew who it was before she spoke. "Dad." Victoria's voice came through the door, softer than it had been in the study, shaped into something that sounded from the outside almost like remorse. "Can I come in?" I looked at Margaret's photograph on the nightstand. "Yes," I said. "Come in." She came in the way water comes into a room with a slow leak, quietly, without the drama of a flood, but with the particular persistence of something that has found its way through a crack and intends to keep going. Victoria was still dressed. She had changed out of the cream blouse into a gray cashmere sweater I recognized as the one she wore when she wanted to appear less formidable than she was, the same sweater she had worn to tell me about Margaret's first diagnosis 6 years ago, sitting at my kitchen table on Dunmore Street, with her hands wrapped around a mug she never drank from. I had registered that sweater then as armor. I registered it now as a costume. She sat in the wooden chair beside my dresser without being invited, which told me the visit had been planned well before she knocked. Spontaneous people ask before they sit. Victoria never asked before she sat. "I've been thinking about what I said downstairs," she began. Her voice had the particular texture of something that had been carefully sanded before being presented. "I was harsh with you, Dad. I know that. The pressure of Eleanor's expectations." She paused, pressed her lips together, shook her head slowly. "That's not an excuse. I just want you to know I'm sorry for how I said it." I looked at my daughter in the low light of the bedside lamp. She had her mother's cheekbones and her mother's hands, long-fingered and expressive, and she was using both of those hands now the way Margaret had never used hers, folded in her lap, in the careful arrangement of someone managing their body language, the same way a contractor manages a job site with attention to what every visible element is communicating. "I appreciate that," I said. She leaned forward slightly. "You know you're the only family I have left that really matters, right? Ethan's people are his people. Daniel has us. But you—" Her voice softened at the edges, and her eyes did something complicated, bright and liquid, that in another context and on another face, I would have called grief. "You're my dad. You're the only one I've got." The words landed with precision. I felt them land. I was 71 years old, and I had loved this woman since the morning she arrived in the world, 7 weeks early, and spent her first 3 days in an incubator at Riverside Methodist Hospital, while Margaret and I sat in plastic chairs in a waiting room and held each other's hands and bargained silently with everything we had. That love did not switch off because a person had been cruel to you. If anything, it made the cruelty hurt more, the way a wound hurts more in a place where the nerve endings are dense. "Victoria," I said carefully, "what did you come in here to say?" Something moved across her face, a flicker of recalibration, and then the softness returned fuller. this time more committed. She reached down beside the chair and lifted a manila folder I had not noticed when she came in, set it on her knees, and pressed both palms flat against it. "I've been meaning to bring this up for a while," she said. "I just kept waiting for the right time, and I know tonight isn't ideal. But after everything today, I keep thinking about how vulnerable you are, Dad. Living here, your accounts, the house in Dayton you still own. If something happened to you, if you got sick, the way Mom did, there'd be no structure in place to protect you." She opened the folder. Inside were 2 documents, each several pages paper-clipped separately. She lifted the first one and held it toward me. "This is a durable power of attorney," she said. "It lets me manage your finances, pay your bills, handle your accounts if you ever get to a point where you can't. It's completely standard. Elder law attorneys recommend it for anyone over 70. I took the document. A durable power of attorney under Ohio law grants another person the legal authority to make financial and legal decisions on your behalf. The word durable means it remains in effect even if the person who signed it becomes mentally incapacitated. It is not a document you sign for convenience. It is a document you sign when you trust someone completely and without reservation, because once signed, it gives that person the same authority over your affairs that you have yourself. I read the first page, then I reached for the second document. "That one's a quitclaim deed," Victoria said, her voice staying at the same measured informational register, the tone of someone explaining rather than selling. "For the Dayton property. It just simplifies the transfer process if anything ever happened. Puts it in both our names, so there's no probate delay, no court involvement. It's cleaner that way. A quitclaim deed transfers whatever ownership interest the signer holds in a property to another party. Unlike a warranty deed, it carries no guarantees and no protections. Once signed, the transfer is immediate and largely irreversible without the new owner's cooperation." I turned to the second page of the deed and read it the way I read every document that had ever mattered to me, slowly, completely beginning to end, including the sections formatted in smaller type that most people treated as decoration rather than content. I had been doing this since 1974 when I signed my first construction contract, and the project manager told me the small print was just standard boilerplate, and I read it anyway and found a liability clause that would have made me personally responsible for any structural failure within 10 years of completion. I got to the third paragraph of page 2. I read it once, then I read it again. The language was precise and comprehensive and buried between 2 sections of genuinely standard boilerplate, with the practiced concealment of something that had been placed there deliberately. It did not merely add Victoria's name to the Dayton property. It transferred sole ownership to Victoria Ann Marsh, removing Walter James Holt entirely from the title upon signing. My hand holding the document did not move. My breathing did not change. The lamp on the nightstand threw a warm, steady light across the page, and I sat with the words in front of me and felt something happen in my chest that was not panic and was not anger, but was the sudden absolute stillness of a man who has just understood exactly where he is standing and exactly what the ground beneath him is made of. "This is a lot to take in tonight," I said. My voice came out with the same level quality it always had, the quality that 30 years of professional life had made permanent. "I'd like to read through both of these properly before I sign anything." Victoria's smile did not waver. "Of course," she said. "Take all the time you need." She stood, smoothed the front of her sweater, and touched my shoulder once with 2 fingers as she moved toward the door. "I just want you to be protected, Dad. That's all this is." She pulled the door closed behind her with a soft, definitive click. I sat with the 2 documents in my lap and looked at Margaret's photograph on the nightstand and did not say a single word for a very long time. Then I set the quitclaim deed face down on the bed beside me, picked up the durable power of attorney, and began reading it again from the beginning. I read both documents through twice before I set them on the nightstand and turned off the lamp. Not because I needed to read them twice to understand them. I had understood the quitclaim deed completely on the first pass. Understood it the way you understand a load calculation that comes back wrong immediately in the stomach before the brain has finished processing the numbers. I read them twice because I wanted to be certain I was not bringing a disposition toward suspicion to language that did not deserve it. I had been wrong about people before. I had misread intentions before. I owed my daughter the discipline of making sure. By the second reading, I was certain. The quitclaim deed as written did not protect me. It removed me. The durable power of attorney as written did not assist me. It replaced me. Together, signed and filed, they would have transferred every significant financial decision of my remaining life to a woman who had stood in her own study 4 hours earlier and told me my place in this house depended on my willingness to lie on her behalf. I turned off the lamp. I lay on top of the covers without undressing because I already knew I would not sleep. And there is a particular indignity in lying in the dark in pajamas, waiting for sleep that will not come when you could instead be lying in the dark in your clothes, thinking clearly about what to do next. The clock moved through midnight, through 1, through 1:30. At 2:11 in the morning, I was thirsty, genuinely thirsty. My mouth dry in the way it gets when the furnace kicks on for the first time in September and pulls the humidity out of the air overnight, and I got up and went down the hallway toward the kitchen in my socks, moving quietly out of the habit of a man who had lived in other people's spaces long enough to know that the sounds you make at 2 in the morning are the ones people remember. The kitchen was dark. I filled a glass from the tap and drank half of it standing at the sink, looking out the window above it, at the backyard, in the September dark. The maple at the back fence had started turning the edges of the leaves, catching the streetlight from Clearfield Drive in a way that made them look like they were lit from inside. I was setting the glass down when I heard Victoria's voice. It came through the window above the sink, which was cracked 2 inches at the bottom, the way Victoria kept it year-round, because she said the house needed to breathe. Her voice was not loud. It had the lowered private register of someone speaking in a room they believe is insulated from the rest of the house, the particular cadence of a conversation that has been going on long enough to have stopped being careful. I did not move. He almost signed it tonight. Her voice was clear and precise, stripped of the softness she had brought to my room an hour ago, the way you strip a costume off after the performance. I could see him starting to. He picked up the pen. Ethan's response was lower, directed away from the window. I caught the shape of it without the words. A question. The deed is the important one, Victoria said. The POA we can work with gradually, but if we get the deeds signed, the Dayton property transfers immediately. That's $420,000 in equity, Ethan. We get that at plus control of his accounts, and the house here is effectively ours to do whatever we want with. I pressed my back against the cabinet below the sink. The tile was cold through my shirt. I breathed in through my nose slowly, the way I had learned to breathe during the first winter after Margaret's diagnosis, when the ground had felt similarly unstable beneath me, and I had needed to teach myself that breathing was something you could do with intention rather than just reflex. Ethan said something longer this time. I heard my name in it. He thinks I feel guilty, Victoria said, and there was something in her voice I had not heard before. Not cruelty exactly, but its close neighbor, the flat, businesslike tone of a person discussing a transaction they have reduced to its components. That's what the sweater was for. He associates it with bad news with Mom. It makes him soft. A pause. He still thinks I care about him. The glass in my hand was very still. The lawyer said as long as he signs voluntarily and appears competent at the time of signing the documents hold. Victoria continued. So we don't push. We let him sit with it for a few days. We keep things calm. Eleanor backs off for now and we just… Another pause, shorter. We just let him feel safe. Ethan said something that sounded like agreement. Then a chair scraped against the floor upstairs, a sound of movement, and Victoria's voice dropped further, almost below the threshold of the open window, and I caught only fragments. Bank accounts. The Dayton property. Before the end of October. Then the window above me went dark as their bedroom light switched off, and the house returned to the silence it had been maintaining before I came downstairs. I stood at the kitchen sink for what I later calculated was approximately 4 minutes, though it felt both shorter and much, much longer than that. The maple at the back fence moved slightly in a wind I couldn't feel from inside, and the lit edges of its leaves shifted and steadied and shifted again. I set the glass down on the counter. I turned and walked back down the hallway toward the stairs, and at the foot of the stairs, I stopped. I looked back at the dark kitchen at the window, cracked 2 inches at the bottom so the house could breathe. Then I went back to the kitchen, took my phone from the counter where I had left it charging, and opened the voice recorder application. Ohio is a one-party consent state, which means that a person may legally record any conversation in which they themselves are a participant or present party without notifying the other parties. I had learned this in 1998 during a contract dispute with a county roads commissioner who had verbal agreements for everything and written agreements for nothing, and the knowledge had sat unused in the back of my mind for 27 years. Like a tool you keep because you sense you will eventually need it. I set the phone face down on the counter near the window. I turned the recorder on. I sat in the kitchen chair closest to the sink, folded my hands on the table, and waited in the dark to see if they would speak again. They did not. But the recorder was running. And I had already heard everything I needed to hear. I climbed back upstairs at 2:55 and sat on the edge of my bed in the dark and looked at the 2 documents on the nightstand and felt something settle into place inside me with the quiet, definitive click of a joint finding its correct alignment after a very long time spent bearing weight at the wrong angle. I did not feel angry. I felt clear. I was downstairs before 6, not because I had slept and woken early, but because somewhere around 4:30, the distinction between lying in the dark thinking and simply getting up had collapsed entirely, and getting up had won. I had washed my face, put on a clean shirt, and come down to the kitchen, the way I had come down to job sites on difficult mornings for 30 years before anyone else arrived, while the space still belonged to the work rather than to the people who would complicate it. The kitchen in the early morning was different from the kitchen of the party. The caterer's linens were gone. The flower arrangements had been moved to the counter and were already beginning to close at the edges in the way cut flowers do when they understand the transaction that has been made. I filled the percolator and stood at the window above the sink while it ran, looking at the maple in the backyard, its turned leaves holding whatever color the early light decided to give them. I had a decision to make, and I had been turning it the same way I had turned structural problems throughout my career, not rushing toward a solution, but walking around the problem slowly until I understood its full geometry. The geometry here was not complicated. It was, in fact, the clearest problem I had faced in years. What was complicated was that the problem had my daughter's face. Victoria came down at 7:15 in her work clothes, which told me she was going into the office on a Saturday, which told me she had something she needed to do that required the resources of her office rather than the house. She poured coffee without looking at me, then turned with the mug in both hands and said in the pleasant, managed tone of someone continuing a conversation they consider already concluded, Did you get a chance to look at those documents any more last night? I did, I said. I'd like a few more days with them. Her fingers tightened around the mug by a fraction. Of course, she said. No rush. She checked her phone, set it face down on the counter, and looked at me with the expression she used when she was deciding how much pressure to apply to a situation. Eleanor called this morning. She wants to know if you've thought about the apology. Tell Eleanor I'm thinking about a great many things, I said. Victoria held my gaze for 3 full seconds, which was 2 seconds longer than the conversation warranted if it was actually about Eleanor. Then she picked up her phone, said she would be back by noon, and left through the garage door. I listened to her car back down the driveway. I counted to 30 after the sound of the engine faded. Then I picked up my phone from the counter, went to the contacts, and found Raymond Cole. Raymond Cole had been my closest friend for 35 years. We had met on a job site in 1990 when he was a Columbus PD officer, doing a safety inspection on a pedestrian bridge I was supervising on the Scioto River, and we had disagreed immediately and completely about the load rating on the central span, argued about it for 40 minutes in the rain, and gone for coffee afterward. Because two men who can argue in the rain for 40 minutes about something neither of them will back down from are either going to be enemies or friends, and we had both apparently decided the same thing simultaneously without discussing it. He was 70 years old now, retired from the force for 6 years, and he was the only person alive who had known both Margaret and me long enough to understand what the last 4 years had cost me without my having to explain it. He answered on the second ring. Bob. His voice was the same as it had always been, the particular rumble of a man whose vocal cords had been shaped by decades of projecting authority across loud environments. It's 6:45 in the morning. I know what time it is, I said. I need to see you today. A pause. Short and calibrated, the pause of a man reading tone rather than words. How bad? Bad enough that I'm calling at 6:45, I said. Noon, he said. My place. I'll have coffee ready. Raymond lived 12 minutes from Clearfield Drive in a house on Granger Avenue that he had owned for 22 years and maintained with the methodical precision of a man who had spent a career noticing what happened when things were allowed to deteriorate. The porch was level, the gutters were clear, and the front walk had been resealed every 3 years without fail. I had always respected that about him. He opened the door before I reached the porch steps, which meant he had been watching for my truck, which meant he had understood from the phone call that this was not a casual visit. I sat at his kitchen table and told him everything in the order it had happened, the same way I would have presented a structural failure assessment, beginning with the observable symptoms, moving through the contributing factors, ending with the root cause. Raymond listened without interrupting, which was the thing about him I had always valued most. He had spent 28 years as a detective, and detectives who interrupt witnesses miss things. He had never once missed a thing. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, both hands around his coffee mug, his eyes level and steady. The recorder, he said. You turned it on before they stopped talking. After, I said. They had already said what they said. But the recorder was running when I went back upstairs. If they speak again near that window, it captures. Raymond nodded slowly. You need Gerald Sims, he said. I thought you might say that. Gerald Sims was an elder law attorney in Columbus who had built his practice entirely around cases involving the financial exploitation of older adults. Raymond had referred 3 families to him over the years, 2 of them involving situations that had eventually resulted in criminal charges under Ohio's elder abuse statutes. He was 62 years old, precise, and had the reputation of a man who did not take cases he did not intend to win. I'll call him this afternoon, Raymond said. He owes me a returned favor from a referral 2 years ago. He'll see you Monday. He set his mug down and looked at me directly. Bob, how are you doing with this? Not the legal part. The other part. I looked at my hands on his kitchen table. The knuckles were still swollen from the September cold, and I had not put on my wedding ring that morning. Not from any intention, but simply because I had been moving too quickly and had forgotten it on the nightstand, and its absence on my left hand felt like a small additional absence in a morning that already had enough of them. She wore Margaret's sweater, I said. Raymond's jaw tightened. He did not say anything, but the lines around his mouth deepened by about 10 years, which from Raymond Cole was the equivalent of a very loud response. I'm all right, I said. I'm better than all right. I just needed to say that out loud to someone. He refilled my coffee without being asked. On the drive back to Clearfield Drive, my phone buzzed on the passenger seat. I glanced at the screen and at a red light on Henderson Road. A text from Victoria. Checking in. How are you feeling today? Dad, hope you're resting. Big week coming up. Let me know if you need anything. I set the phone face down on the seat and drove the remaining 4 minutes in the particular silence of a man who has just confirmed, beyond any remaining doubt, exactly what he is dealing with. The thing about performing confusion is that it requires a particular kind of discipline most people do not associate with the performance. Anyone can pretend to be lost. The difficult part is pretending to be lost at exactly the right depth, confused enough to be convincing, functional enough not to trigger intervention, present enough to keep observing. Too far in either direction, and the performance collapses. I had spent 30 years assessing structural tolerances on highway projects, and I applied the same precision to this one. Every display of weakness had to be load-tested before deployment. I started on a Sunday evening. Ethan was in the kitchen making the chili he made every Sunday, the same recipe he had been making since I moved in. Dried beans soaked overnight, 2 kinds of pepper, a bottle of dark beer added at the 40-minute mark, the whole process taking the better part of 3 hours and filling the house with a smell I had always genuinely liked. I came downstairs in my cardigan, stood in the kitchen doorway, and looked at the stove with the mildly bewildered expression of a man who has walked into a room and momentarily lost the thread of why. Something smells good, I said. Is Margaret cooking? The ladle in Ethan's hand stopped moving. He turned slowly the way a person turns when they have heard something they need to verify before responding to. His eyes moved over my face with the careful attention of a man reading a document he has not seen before and is trying to determine its significance. So Margaret passed away, Walter, he said. His voice was even measured, the voice of someone choosing their words, the way you choose footing on uncertain ground. 4 years ago, I let my face do what I needed it to do. A small, soft confusion, the eyes going slightly unfocused, the mouth pressing together in the expression of a man reaching for something just out of reach. Of course, I said. Of course she did. I don't know why I said that. I touched the door frame with one hand, a gesture of mild steadying. The smell just reminded me. Ethan looked at me for 3 full seconds. Then he turned back to the stove and said carefully, "Dinner's at 7, Walter." "Thank you, son," I said. I went back upstairs. In my room, I sat at my work table and opened the small spiral notebook I had bought at the Walgreens on Henderson Road the previous afternoon. The kind with the black cardboard cover that cost $1.69 and looked like nothing in particular. I wrote the date, the time, and a precise summary of the exchange, including Ethan's exact words and the duration of the pause before he spoke. Then I slid the notebook under the false bottom of my work table drawer, a space I had created years ago on Dunmore Street for storing documents I did not want accidentally discovered, and which I had reinstalled in this table when I moved. Over the following 9 days, I built the performance incrementally, the way you build a load-bearing structure one verified element at a time, each piece checked before the next was added. On Monday, I asked Victoria twice what day it was, spacing the questions 4 hours apart. She answered the first time with patience, and the second time with a glance at Ethan that lasted approximately 1.5 seconds and carried the compressed information of a longer conversation they had apparently already had. On Wednesday, I left my reading glasses on the kitchen counter and spent 20 minutes searching for them with the methodical, low-grade distress of a man who cannot locate something he depends on. Daniel found them and brought them to me with the solemn helpfulness of a child who has been told in language just above his comprehension that Grandpa needed extra looking after. The expression on his face when he handed them to me, careful, tender, slightly frightened, cost me more than anything else in those 9 days, and I folded it away somewhere I did not look at too often. On Friday, I knocked over a glass of water at the dinner table. Not dramatically. A slow, inattentive sweep of the forearm, the kind of thing that happens to everyone but which, in context, landed in the room with the particular resonance of a data point, confirming an existing hypothesis. Victoria cleaned it up without comment. Ethan refilled my glass without being asked. Both of them were very kind about it, the specific, effortful kindness of people who believe they are managing a situation and are pleased with how the management is proceeding. Meanwhile, behind the performance, I was working. I had taken to rising at 5 each morning before the house stirred. In those early hours, I photographed the documents Victoria had given me, with my phone capturing each page twice from 2 angles, then uploaded the images to the cloud storage account I had set up at the library on Carl Road, using the library's Wi-Fi rather than the home network, on the advice of Raymond, who had pointed out that home network activity was the kind of thing a technically capable person could monitor if they were motivated to do so. And Ethan worked in financial services, which suggested a baseline level of technical capability worth respecting. I photographed everything I could access in the study Ethan used as a home office, working quickly on the 2 mornings when Victoria left early and Ethan was in the shower. Bank statements that referenced accounts I had not known existed. A spreadsheet on the desk, printed and paper-clipped, showing projected figures against a column labeled H assets, which were my initials, organized into categories I recognized as my savings account, my investment portfolio, and the Dayton property. On the 9th day, a Thursday evening, I was sitting in the armchair in the living room with a book I was not reading when Ethan came in from the garage and stopped in the doorway to the hallway, his phone against his ear, conducting a conversation he had either forgotten I was present for or had decided I was no longer worth the adjustment of postponing. "The timeline still works," he said to whoever was on the other end. "He's declining faster than we expected, honestly. Vic thinks we can move by the end of the month." A pause while the other party responded. "No, he won't contest it. He barely remembers what day it is." I turned a page of my book. My hand was completely steady. I had learned in 30 years of assessing structures under load that the most important measurement you could take was not the measurement of the stress itself, but the measurement of the margin remaining before failure. I was not anywhere near failure. I was, in fact, precisely where I intended to be. Ethan finished his call and came through the living room without looking at me, heading for the kitchen, his mind already on whatever came next. "Good night, Ethan," I said as he passed. "Night, Walter," he said, not breaking stride. I waited until I heard the kitchen faucet run. Then I reached into the pocket of my cardigan and pressed stop on the voice recorder application that had been running since I sat down in that armchair 2 hours and 14 minutes ago. I looked at the book in my lap. It was a novel about a bridge engineer in the 1920s who builds a crossing that everyone says cannot be built, and which stands for 100 years after the engineer himself is gone. Margaret had given it to me for Christmas in 2018, and I had never gotten around to reading it. I was finding it very good. The Saturday morning light in Columbus in early October has a quality I have never been able to describe accurately to anyone who has not lived here long enough to recognize it themselves. It comes in low and specific, the way good light always comes at an angle that makes ordinary things look like they have been considered. The maple at the back fence was fully turned, now the leaves a color somewhere between copper and rust that Margaret had always called honest red, because she said it was the one color in nature that did not try to be anything other than exactly what it was. I was sitting on the back porch steps with my coffee at 7:15 when Daniel came through the screen door in his Saturday clothes jeans and the Ohio State sweatshirt, 2 sizes too large that he had claimed from a box of Ethan's old things and refused to relinquish despite Victoria's 3 separate attempts to donate it. He sat down beside me on the steps, without asking, the way he had always sat beside me with the unceremonious ease of a child who has decided you are furniture in the best possible sense, permanent and weight-bearing and entirely trustworthy. We sat for a few minutes without talking, which was one of the things I valued most about my grandson. He had inherited from somewhere, not from Victoria and not from Ethan, the ability to be comfortable in quiet. Most 8-year-olds I had known treated silence as a problem to be solved. Daniel treated it as a condition to be inhabited. "Grandpa," he said finally. I had agreed with his reasoning completely. "What's on your mind, buddy?" I said. He looked at the maple. "Mom said you've been forgetting things." I wrapped both hands around my coffee mug. The morning air was cold enough that the warmth of it mattered. "Did she? She said I should be patient with you." He paused, turning this over. "She said it happens when people get old." The particular quality of what moved through my chest in that moment was not something I could have named cleanly. It was the compound sensation of a man who is lying to everyone in his life for a reason he is completely certain of discovering that the lie has reached the one person he would have protected from it at any cost. "Daniel," I said carefully, "do I seem like I'm forgetting things to you?" He looked at me with the direct, undecorated assessment of a child who has not yet learned to soften observations for the comfort of the person being observed. "No," he said. "You seem the same as always. You knew exactly what was wrong with my bike last week when I said the wheel was making a sound. You said the spoke was loose and you were right." "I did say that." I agreed. And you remembered that today was exactly 3 weeks since the party without looking at a calendar." He picked up a fallen maple leaf from the step beside him and turned it in his fingers. "You don't forget things, Grandpa. You just sometimes pretend not to remember things. I've seen you do it." I was quiet for a moment. The coffee mug was very warm against my palms. "You're a very observant young man," I said. "Mom says that too," he said. "She doesn't mean it as a compliment." I looked at my grandson's profile, the concentrated expression of a child working something out, and felt the particular weight of a decision I had not anticipated having to make on a Saturday morning on the back porch steps. I had not planned to tell Daniel anything. He was 8 years old, and the things happening in this house were not 8-year-old things. But Daniel was looking at me with the clear, serious eyes of a child who had already seen more than I had intended him to see. And there is a particular disrespect in lying to someone who already knows you are lying, regardless of how old they are. "I need you to trust me about something," I said. "Can you do that?" He stopped turning the leaf. "Yes. Some things are happening that grown-ups need to work out," I said. "And while they're being worked out, I need everyone to think that I'm not paying very close attention. Does that make sense?" He thought about it for a moment with the seriousness it deserved. Like when I knew where Dad hid the Christmas presents, but I pretended I didn't, so he'd still think it was a surprise. Exactly like that, I said. He nodded slowly, satisfied with the parallel. Then he said, "Is everything going to be okay?" I put my hand on his shoulder, the same firm grip I had used on the edge of his bed 8 nights ago. The grip that meant I am here, and I am certain. "Everything is going to be more than okay," I said. "I promise you that." He leaned against my arm, and we sat there for a while longer, watching the honest red maple hold its color against the October morning. A cardinal landed on the fence post at the back corner looked at us with the brief judicial attention of a bird that has decided we are not interesting enough to warrant further investigation, and flew away. "Grandpa," Daniel said, "what was the vase worth, the one that broke?" "About $20,000, I said. "When your grandmother bought it, he absorbed this with the particular stillness of a child, processing a number too large for immediate comprehension. "That's a lot of money." "It is. But you said it wasn't about the money." I looked at him. I had said that. I had said it to Margaret's photograph at 2 in the morning 8 days ago, alone in my room, with no one within earshot. I had said it quietly and without expectation of being heard by anyone living. "When did I say that?" I asked. Daniel looked at the maple. "You talk sometimes when you think everyone's asleep," he said without apology or particular emphasis, the way he reported most things. "I can hear you from my room if my door's open." The cardinal came back to the fence post. This time it stayed. I reached over and put my arm around my grandson's shoulders and held on, and he let me in the way children let you hold on when they understand that the holding is for you as much as for them. "You're right," I said. "It's not about the money." He picked up his maple leaf again. "I know," he said. "It's about the broom." I looked at him. "The broom. The one nobody swept up the pieces with," he said simply. "I looked for them the next morning and they were already gone. But nobody swept them up for you. Nobody said they were sorry about the vase, Grandpa, about what it actually was." I pressed my lips together. I looked at the fence post where the cardinal had been and was no longer. Then I picked up my phone from the step beside me and called Gerald Sims. Gerald Sims kept his office on the 4th floor of a building on High Street that had been respectable in 1978 and had maintained that respectability through the particular stubbornness of a structure that knows its own value and sees no reason to renegotiate. Dark wood paneling on 2 walls, carpet the color of old bourbon. A receptionist named Carol who offered me coffee in a ceramic mug without asking how I took it, which told me Raymond had called ahead with specifics because Raymond Cole had never in 35 years failed to brief a room before I entered it. I took the coffee and sat in a leather chair that had the particular give of something that had held a great many people through difficult conversations and had developed over time a kind of informed sympathy for the weight of them. Gerald came out to the waiting area himself. He was 62 years old, shorter than I had expected from Raymond's description, with the compact, economical build of a man who had long ago stopped spending energy on anything that did not serve a direct purpose. He shook my hand at the door and looked me directly in the eyes for long enough to constitute an assessment rather than a greeting, then said, "Walter, come on back." Carol hold my 10 o'clock. His office was smaller than the waiting area and tidier than most. 2 walls of bookshelves floor to ceiling. A desk with exactly 4 things on it, a legal pad, a pen, a file folder with my name on the tab, and a coffee mug that matched the one Carol had given me, which suggested a man who applied consistency to small decisions as a matter of principle. He sat, uncapped his pen, and said, "Tell me what's happening. Start from the beginning and don't edit." So I told him. All of it in the order it had occurred. with the same precision I had used with Raymond's symptoms, first contributing factors, second root cause, last. I laid the two documents on his desk as I reached them in the account, the durable power of attorney and the quitclaim deed, and watched him read each one with the focused, unhurried attention of a man for whom documents were primary rather than supplementary evidence. He read without interrupting. When I finished, he set his pen down and picked up the quitclaim deed and held it for a moment. The way a structural engineer holds a blueprint. He has found a problem in not with alarm, but with the particular stillness of professional recognition. Under Ohio law, he said, what your daughter has presented you with constitutes textbook elder financial exploitation. Ohio Revised Code. Section 2913.02 covers theft by deception, which is what the quitclaim deed represents: obtaining property through misrepresentation of its purpose and effect. The durable POA as drafted would additionally give her authority to liquidate your investment accounts, redirect your pension deposits, and make binding financial commitments on your behalf without your ongoing knowledge or consent. Is it a felony? I asked. Gerald said. The Dayton property alone at $420,000 places this well above the threshold. We are talking about potential prison time, Walter, not a civil judgment. He set the deed down and looked at me. You mentioned a recording. 2, I said. The first is a conversation between my daughter and her husband overheard through an open window recorded on my phone. After the fact, they had already said what they said before I turned the recorder on, but the device was running and captured ambient sound from that location for the remainder of the night. The second is a phone conversation Ethan conducted in my presence 9 days later, recorded while I was in the same room. Gerald nodded. Ohio is a one-party consent state. Any recording in which you are a present party, or which captures conversation in a space where you have legal right to be, is admissible in both civil and criminal proceedings. Both recordings are usable. He made a note on his legal pad. The spreadsheet you photographed, the one with the WH assets column. Uploaded to a cloud account accessible from any device, I said. Along with photographs of both documents, something moved across Gerald's face that was not quite a smile, but was its professional equivalent, the expression of a man who has prepared for a difficult case and has just discovered the preparation was unnecessary because the client did it himself. You've been thorough, he said. I was a structural engineer for 30 years, I said. Documentation was the job. He leaned back in his chair. What do you want, Walter? Not what you think you're entitled to. What do you actually want from this? I had been turning that question since 4:30 in the morning on September 28th, and I had my answer ready. The way you have an answer ready when you have had enough time to find the true one rather than the convenient one. But I want 3 things, I said. First, I want a revocable living trust established immediately with Daniel as sole beneficiary, the Dayton property, my savings and investment accounts, everything. Once the assets are in the trust, Victoria and Ethan have no legal pathway to reach them, regardless of what documents they convince me to sign. Gerald was writing. Continue. Second, I want both documents voided and a formal record established of the attempt to obtain my signature under fraudulent misrepresentation. Not filed immediately, prepared and held. And third, I looked at the legal pad where Gerald was writing at my name on the file folder tab, at the coffee mug that matched the one in the waiting area. Third, I said, I want to be the one who decides when and how this ends. Not Victoria, not Ethan, not Eleanor. Me. I want the documents ready, the trust funded, and the evidence organized. And then I want to wait until the right moment to use it. Gerald looked up from the legal pad. He held my gaze for a moment with the evaluating attention he had given me when he came out to the waiting room, the look of a man revising an initial assessment in light of additional information. "Hi, most clients who come to me in your situation want to act immediately," he said. "They want the other party confronted, the documents challenged, the police called." "I understand that," I said. "You don't want that." "I want it done right," I said. "There's a difference." Gerald looked at me for another moment. Then he uncapped his pen again, pulled a fresh sheet from his legal pad, and began writing with the quick, decisive strokes of a man who has made up his mind about something. "The trust can be drafted and executed by end of week," he said. "Once it's filed with the county recorder's office, no sale or transfer of those assets can proceed without the trustee's authorization. You would name yourself as trustee during your lifetime with a successor trustee of your choosing." He paused. "Raymond, perhaps." "Raymond," I agreed. "And the confrontation," Gerald said, still writing. "When you're ready for that, I want to be in the room." I picked up my coffee mug. It had gone slightly cool while we talked, the way coffee does when the conversation it was meant to accompany turns out to be more important than the drinking of it. "You will be," I said. The trust was filed with the Franklin County Recorder's Office on a Friday afternoon, and Gerald called me at 4:17 to confirm it. I was sitting in the armchair with my book about the bridge engineer when he read the recording number aloud. I said thank you, set the phone on my knee, and sat with the particular stillness of a man who has just watched the most important load-bearing element of a structure click into its final position. Daniel's future was protected. Whatever Victoria and Ethan signed or arranged, they could not reach the Dayton property, my savings, or my investment portfolio. Those assets now lived inside a legal structure that required my authorization to move in any direction, with Raymond Cole as successor trustee and Daniel Robert Holt as sole beneficiary upon my death. I read 12 more pages of my book. Then Victoria came home and I set it spine up on the armrest and resumed being a man who forgot things. The camera was the discovery I had not planned for. I found it on a Tuesday morning when I was alone in the house for the first time since September. I used the hours the way I had always used unexpected free time on a job site, walked the space systematically corner to corner, looking at what was actually there, rather than what I had been told was there. The camera was mounted above the refrigerator, small and matte black, a Nest model that stored footage in cloud-based rolling storage. I stood on the step stool and noted its field of view without touching it. It covered the kitchen table, the counter, the chair where I read the newspaper. It did not cover the window above the sink, the window I had been standing at when I overheard Victoria and Ethan, which was outside its angle by approximately 15 degrees. I replaced the step stool precisely where it had been and went to Ethan's study. The financial files were perfect, color-coded, and chronological. The household files were approximate. In the center desk drawer, paper-clipped to a business card from a real estate broker named Dennis Paulson at RE Max Capital on Morse Road, was a 4-page purchase agreement template. The property address on the first line was mine, 441 Linden Avenue, Dayton, Ohio. The house Margaret and I had bought in 1984 and never released because she had wanted us to have a place that was entirely and permanently ours. The listing price was $410,000. At the bottom of the last page in Ethan's handwriting, after signature move immediately. I photographed all 4 pages, and the business card uploaded everything to the cloud account at the Carl Road Library and returned the drawer to exactly the position I had found it. Then I heard the front door. Eleanor Marsh came through it with biscuit on her arm and a casserole dish in her free hand, moving through my daughter's house with the proprietary ease of a woman who had decided invitation was a formality she had graduated beyond. She stopped when she saw me. Her eyes moved to the study door, then back to my face. "Walter," You're home. I live here, I said pleasantly. The social warmth came back up across her face like a thermostat correcting for a draft. She had heard about my memory troubles, she said. She had brought something home cooked. She tilted her head at the angle she used when performing concern and asked how I was feeling. I looked at Eleanor standing in that hallway with her casserole and her cat, and her carefully arranged expression, and felt the specific clarifying sensation of understanding exactly what I was looking at. I feel very well, I said. Thank you for asking. Biscuit looked at me with his flat, imperial gaze and then looked away. It was the most honest response anyone in that hallway produced. I took out my phone and sent Gerald a single message. Found the listing agreement for Dayton. Unsigned, but dated. Photographed and uploaded. His reply came back in 4 minutes. Good. We're ready when you are. Eleanor's casserole turned out to be chicken and rice, which she served herself from the dish with the proprietary ease of a woman setting her own table moving through Victoria's kitchen with a familiarity that had been built, I understood now, not from friendship but from investment. She had put time into this house, into Victoria, into the position she occupied at the center of decisions that were not technically hers to make. And she protected that position the way any investor protects a position, by monitoring it, by showing up, and by making herself indispensable before anyone thought to question whether she had been invited. We ate at the kitchen table, the three of us, Eleanor, Victoria, and I, while Ethan worked late and Daniel ate his portion in front of a history documentary. He had selected himself, which was the kind of child he was given the choice between television and learning. He reliably chose learning, and then got absorbed enough in it that the distinction stopped mattering. Eleanor talked about her garden. She talked about the neighborhood association meeting she had attended Tuesday. She talked about a friend of hers who had recently moved her elderly father into a managed care facility in Upper Arlington, delivering this information with the particular conversational precision of a woman who is not really talking about her friend. He resisted for months, Eleanor said, setting her fork down with the air of someone arriving at the point they had been building toward for the last 10 minutes. But once he accepted it, his daughter said he seemed almost relieved. Sometimes we hold on to our independence past the point where it's actually serving us. She looked at me across the table with an expression calibrated to resemble concern. Don't you think, Walter? I looked at my chicken and rice. I think your friend's father would know better than I would, I said. Eleanor's mouth curved slightly. Victoria was looking at her water glass. The thing is, Eleanor continued, her voice dropping into the register of genuine conversation while remaining entirely performance. Victoria and Ethan have put so much thought into this. The paperwork, the arrangements. They just want you comfortable and safe, Walter. There's no shame in letting the people who love you take the wheel for a while. Take the wheel. I noted the phrase in the part of my mind that had been noting things for 4 weeks, the same part that had been watching Eleanor's hands and Victoria's posture and the distance Ethan maintained from conversations he had helped engineer, but preferred not to be seen near. That's very kind, I said, after Eleanor left. Victoria sat across from me at the kitchen table with her hands folded in front of her and her face arranged into the expression she used when she had decided a conversation was going to happen, whether the other party was ready for it or not. Dad, she said, I need to know where you are on the documents. 9 days ago, she had sat in my room in Margaret's sweater and held a folder in her lap and called it protection. Tonight, she was sitting across a kitchen table at 9:15 in the evening and calling it a conversation, and the difference between those two framings was the difference between a door being opened and a door being pushed. I've been thinking about them, I said. It's been almost a month, Dad. I'm aware of that, Her jaw tightened by the fraction I had come to recognize as the outermost boundary of her patience. "Ethan has a meeting with the bank on Thursday," she said, "about restructuring some accounts. It would be helpful, significantly helpful, if the POA were in place before then." There it was. Not protection, not comfort. A bank meeting on Thursday, and the word helpful deployed with the precision of a tool. I folded my napkin on the table. I pressed it flat with my palm. "I'll look at them again tonight," I said. Victoria studied my face for a long moment. Then she nodded, pushed back her chair, and said she was going to bed. She kissed the top of my head as she passed the way she had not done since I was a useful thing in this house, rather than a complicated one. And I sat at the kitchen table after she left and listened to the house settle around me and thought about Thursday and bank meetings and the word helpful and what it meant when a daughter kissed her father's head on the way to implementing a plan to take everything he had built. At 10:45, I went upstairs. At 11, I checked on Daniel, who was asleep with his history textbook open on his chest, and I lifted it carefully and set it on his nightstand and pulled his blanket up and stood in the doorway of his room for a moment, looking at the uncomplicated fact of him, this child who had told me about brooms and broken things and the difference between what was gone and what could be fixed. Then I went to my room and called Gerald Sims. "Thursday," I said when he answered. "They want the POA signed before a bank meeting Thursday. I think we do it Wednesday." A pause, brief and certain. "I'll book the conference room," Gerald said. 9 o'clock. Tell me who you want in that room." "You," I said. "Raymond, and whoever Victoria and Ethan bring." "Done," Gerald said. "Walter, are you ready?" I looked at Margaret's photograph on the nightstand. The Tuesday morning one, the blue robe, the coffee mug against her cheek, the expression of a woman pretending to be annoyed and failing at it completely. "I've been ready," I said, since September 28th. The house went quiet at 11:30. I heard Victoria's bedroom door close, then Ethan's voice low and indistinct for a few minutes, then nothing. The particular nothing of a house that has finished with its people for the night and is simply existing in the dark joists and floorboards and window frames, doing the slow, patient work of holding everything together without being asked. I sat at my work table with the spiral notebook open in front of me. Not to write anything new. Everything that needed to be written had been written, dated, itemized, uploaded, filed. I sat with it open because it had become, over the past 5 weeks, something close to a record of who I still was when no one in this house was looking, and I needed to hold that record in my hands for a few minutes before tomorrow. I had filled 31 pages. The first entry was September 28th at 3 in the morning. The handwriting was steady, which still surprised me when I looked at it, because I remembered the feeling in my hands that night. And steady was not the word I would have chosen. But the handwriting was steady, and the observations were precise, and the documentation was complete. And that told me something about the distance between how a thing feels from the inside and what it actually produces on the page. I turned to Margaret's photograph. "Tomorrow," I told her. I said it the way I had said things to her photograph for 4 years, not expecting an answer. Not performing grief, just maintaining the particular discipline of continuing to speak to someone you love, even after the speaking becomes a one-way thing, because the alternative is silence, and silence has a way of becoming permanent if you let it settle long enough. "Raymond will be there," I said. "And Gerald, and I'll have everything we built together in that folder, the Dayton house, the savings, everything we put aside for 40 years. My throat tightened. I pressed my fingers flat against the open notebook. "I kept it, Margaret. All of it. It's still there." At 12:15, I called Raymond. He answered on the first ring, which meant he had been awake and had been expecting the call, which was Raymond Cole, in its purest form, present before you arrived, ready before you asked. "Bob," he said. "I'm calling to say thank you," I said. "Before tomorrow, while I still have the quiet to say it properly." A pause. The kind Raymond took when he was deciding whether to deflect or receive something. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "I know I don't need to," I said. "I'm choosing to. There's a difference." He was quiet for a moment. "Gerald has everything ready," he said. "Conference room on the 4th floor. 9 o'clock. I'll be there at 8:30. Raymond." I stopped. She was the only one I told. When Margaret was in the hospital that last winter. You and her were the only ones who knew how bad it was before I told the others. My voice came out rougher than I intended. You drove to the hospital at 2 in the morning on a Tuesday, and you sat with me in that waiting room for 4 hours, and you didn't say a single unnecessary word. "You would have done the same," Raymond said. "I would have," I agreed. "But you did it first." He cleared his throat once. "Get some sleep, Bob," he said. "You're going to need to be sharp tomorrow." "I'll be sharp," I said. I set the phone down and looked at the notebook and the photograph and the 2 original documents Gerald had returned to me after making certified copies, the POA and the quitclaim deed, each stamped void across the face in red ink, prepared, and waiting for the moment they would be placed on a conference table in front of the people who had created them. I thought about Daniel asleep down the hall with his history textbook and his Ohio State sweatshirt, and his absolute uncalculating certainty that his grandfather was not a man who forgot things. I thought about the broom nobody had used. I thought about the honest red maple that had gone bare in the yard this week. The leaves down the branches clear against the November sky, the tree itself unchanged beneath the surface that everyone saw. I closed the notebook. I placed it in my bag alongside the folder of documents. I set the bag by the door, the way I had always set things by the door, when tomorrow required them within reach, prepared ready to be carried without searching. Then I lay down on top of the covers without undressing, the same way I had lain down on September 28th, and I looked at the ceiling of the small room that had never fully been mine, and thought about the room I would wake up in a month from now, and the one after that, and the particular freedom of a man who has decided what he will and will not carry forward. I was asleep before 1 o'clock. For the first time in 5 weeks, I did not wake until morning. I woke at 5:53 without an alarm. The room was still dark, the November light not yet making its argument at the window, and I lay on top of the covers for exactly 1 minute doing the thing I had learned to do in the years after Margaret's diagnosis, taking a full inventory of what I actually felt before deciding what I thought about it. What I felt was rested, clear. The particular clarity of a man who has carried something heavy for a long time and has finally reached the place where he is going to set it down. I got up and dressed carefully. Dark trousers, the white Oxford shirt Margaret had picked out at Lazarus in downtown Columbus in the fall of 2017. The last fall, before her diagnosis, on an afternoon when we had nothing particular to do, and she had decided we should walk downtown, because the weather was the specific kind of cool that she said made the city look like it meant it. She had held the shirt up against my shoulders in the aisle and said it was exactly right, and I had agreed with her because she was always right about those things. And I had learned early in our marriage that agreeing with Margaret on matters of clothing was one of the more reliable ways to move through life efficiently. I put on my wedding ring. I had not forgotten it since the morning after the party. I had not allowed myself to forget it again. I carried my bag downstairs at 6:15. The kitchen was empty, and I made coffee in the quiet the way I had made it every morning for 2 years. in this house measuring by hand rather than by the scoop, because the scoop Victoria kept by the percolator was slightly too shallow and produced coffee that tasted to my particular preference like a good idea that had not been fully committed to. I was at the window with my mug when Victoria came down at 7. She was dressed for the office laptop bag over one shoulder, moving with the forward momentum of a woman who had a full day planned and had already arranged it in her mind in the sequence she intended to execute it. She poured coffee without looking at me, then turned. "You're up early," she said. "Old habit," I said. She looked at my shirt. Something moved across her face, recognition, or something adjacent to it, and then she looked at her phone. "Don't forget we have the appointment this afternoon," she said. 2 o'clock at the downtown office, Ethan's attorney recommended. "Just paperwork, Dad. Shouldn't take more than an hour." "I'd prefer we use Gerald Sims on High Street," I said, keeping my voice mild. "He handled your mother's estate affairs. I'd feel more comfortable signing there." She shrugged, already looking at her phone. "Fine. As long as it gets signed today, Gerald's office works. I'll be there," I said. She nodded, kissed Daniel's lunchbox on the counter with the automatic affection of a mother in motion, and went back upstairs to finish getting ready. I stood at the window and looked at the bare maple in the backyard and drank my coffee and thought about the word, just as she had used it. Just paperwork. Just an hour. The small words people use when they are trying to make a large thing feel smaller than it is, either for your benefit or for their own. I had heard that particular usage in contract negotiations and project reviews and hospital waiting rooms, and I had learned that just was almost always the word that preceded the thing that mattered most. Daniel came downstairs at 7:20 in his school clothes backpack already on both shoulders, his hair damp from the shower. He stopped when he saw me at the window. "You're wearing the good shirt," he said. "I am?" I said. He looked at me with the steady, clear assessment he had inherited from no one I could identify and everyone I had ever loved. "Is today the day?" he asked. I looked at my grandson. 8 years old, damp hair, backpack straps adjusted to exactly the right tension, the way I had shown him, the Ohio State sweatshirt visible beneath his open jacket, because he wore it under everything, now a fact Victoria had given up addressing. "Today is the day," I said. He crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and put both arms around my waist, the way he had on every significant occasion of his life, with the full and unguarded force of a child who has not yet learned that holding on can be mistaken for needing to. I put my hand on the back of his head and held on for a moment that was exactly as long as it needed to be. "I know," I said. He pulled back and looked up at me, and his chin was steady and his eyes were clear, and he was the most honest thing in that house by a margin I could not have measured. "I'll see you tonight," I said. He nodded once, picked up his lunchbox from the counter, and went out the front door to wait for the school bus with the matter-of-fact composure of a boy who has been told what he needed to know and has decided to trust it completely. I watched the door close behind him. Then I picked up my bag, set my coffee mug in the sink, and walked to the garage. I backed out of the driveway slowly, the way I always backed out, checking both mirrors, then the rear view, then the mirrors again, and drove toward High Street in the early November light. I arrived at Gerald Sims's office building at 7:51. Raymond's truck was already in the parking lot. Of course it was. Before I reveal the exact moment Walter pushed that voided document across the table and completely shattered his daughter's scheme, drop the number 7 in the comments right now. So I know you're still here riding this journey with me. And a quick note, the upcoming section includes some fictionalized elements crafted for dramatic effect. If this style of storytelling isn't your preference, feel free to step away right here. They arrived at 2:04. I heard them before I saw them. Victoria's heels on the hardwood floor of the hallway, outside the particular rhythm I had been listening to for 2 years, purposeful and unhesitating, the sound of a woman who had decided where she was going and had not yet discovered she was already too late. The conference room door opened. Victoria stepped in first. Her eyes found me immediately, the way eyes find the thing they were not expecting. And for exactly 2 seconds, her face did something she could not control, a rapid, total recalibration. The expression of a person who has walked onto a stage and discovered the set has been rearranged without their knowledge. Ethan came in behind her and stopped with his hand still on the door. Gerald was seated to my left. Raymond was to my right. On the table in front of me was the spiral notebook, the cloud-printed photographs of the quitclaim deed and POA, the Dayton listing agreement with Dennis Paulson's commission noted in pencil in the margin, and the 2 original documents stamped void in red ink. Beside those, the trust instrument filed with Franklin County with Daniel Robert Holt's name on the beneficiary line. Victoria looked at the table. She looked at Gerald. She looked at Raymond. Then she looked at me, and I could see her assembling something, a response, an explanation, a version of events that might still be navigable, and I let her assemble it because I had waited 5 weeks and I could wait another 30 seconds. "Dad," she said. "What is this?" I looked at my daughter across the conference table in the November afternoon light, coming through the 4th-floor window. This woman I had driven to soccer practice and danced with at her wedding and sat beside in a hospital waiting room when Daniel arrived 7 weeks early, and the world had contracted to the size of an incubator and a prayer. "This," I said quietly, "is the conversation we should have had on September 28th. You never apologized because you felt sorry," I said. "You apologized because you needed my signature." Victoria's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Ethan sat down heavily in the chair nearest the door, the chair of a man whose legs have stopped being reliable. Gerald uncapped his pen. Gerald spoke for 11 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the wall above the door the same way I had watched the clock above the fireplace at Daniel's birthday party when Eleanor gave her performance, and I had counted the minutes without appearing to count anything at all. Gerald laid it out the way a structural engineer lays out a failure analysis, cause, mechanism, consequence in that order, without editorializing. The documents constituted elder financial exploitation under Ohio Revised Code, Section 2913-02. The recorded conversations established intent. The Dayton listing agreement established scope. Eleanor Marsh was named in the file as a contributing party whose actions on September 27th, including the deliberate misattribution of the Vass incident, formed part of a documented pattern. Ethan's attorney, a young man named Patterson, who had arrived 5 minutes after Victoria and had not said a single word since sitting down, was writing very fast. Victoria was not writing. Victoria was looking at her hands. "The trust is filed and funded," Gerald continued. "Any attempt to access, transfer, or encumber those assets will be met with immediate legal action. Criminal referral to the Franklin County Prosecutor's Office remains at Mr. Holt's discretion." At Mr. Holt's discretion. Victoria looked up at that. Her eyes found mine across the table, and they were red at the rims, and her mouth was pressed into the shape of a woman holding something together with the last of what she had. "Dad!" Her voice came out cracked down the middle. "Please." I looked at my daughter for a long moment. At the cheekbones that were Margaret's, and the hands that were Margaret's, and the particular way her chin lifted when she was trying not to fall apart, that was entirely, completely, irreducibly hers. "I love you, Victoria," I said. "I have loved you since before you were born. That does not change today." She pressed both hands flat on the table. Her shoulders dropped. "But today, I said, I am choosing myself. I pushed back my chair. I stood. Raymond stood beside me without being asked the way he had been doing things beside me for 35 years. I picked up my bag. Gerald will be in touch, I said. I walked to the door. I did not look back at the table at the voided documents and the listed evidence, and the young attorney writing very fast, and the man who had married my daughter sitting with his hands pressed against his thighs, like a boy waiting to be told what comes next. I had learned a long time ago that looking back does not make leaving easier. It only makes it slower. 2 weeks later, I was sitting at Raymond's kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the particular morning quiet of a house that belongs entirely to the man living in it. Raymond had given me the room at the end of the hall without discussion, the same way he had given me everything over 35 years, by simply making it available and then getting out of the way. The room had a window that faced east, which meant I woke to actual light, instead of the north-facing gray I had been waking to on Clearfield Drive for 2 years. And the difference that made to the first 5 minutes of every morning was something I had not anticipated and could not adequately explain. Daniel visited on a Saturday. He came through Raymond's front door with his backpack on both shoulders and his Ohio State sweatshirt under his jacket and his shoelaces untied, and he crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and put his arms around my waist with the full, unguarded force of a child who had been waiting to do exactly this for 2 weeks and had been patient about it in the way children are patient when they have been asked to be and have chosen to honor that request. I held on. We sat at Raymond's kitchen table and I made hot chocolate from the tin in the cabinet above the coffee maker. And Daniel told me about his week with the focused, sequential accuracy of a child who has been saving things up. His science project. A substitute teacher who did not know the classroom rules and had been gently corrected by the class. A dead squirrel he and Caleb had buried beneath the oak tree in the backyard with, in his words, full honors. "Grandpa," he said, wrapping both hands around his mug, "did you fix it?" I looked at my grandson and across Raymond's kitchen table. "The broom," he said simply. I felt the word land in my chest the way it had landed on the back porch steps 6 weeks ago, with the same specific weight of a thing said by someone who understood exactly what they were saying, without fully understanding why it needed to be said. "Yes," I said. I swept it up. His face did what his face did when something resolved itself to his satisfaction, a small, complete settling like a level finding true. Then my phone buzzed on the table. I looked at the screen. Victoria. Just her name, nothing beneath it. The particular silence of a message that has not yet decided what it wants to be. I turned the phone face down. "Tell me about the squirrel," I said. Daniel told me about the squirrel. She came on a Sunday morning without Ethan, without a folder, with nothing except her coat, and the expression of a woman who has run out of performances and arrived finally at her own face. We sat on Raymond's front porch. Victoria looked at her hands before she looked at me. "I don't know how to start," she said. "Then just talk," I said. She talked for a long time. About the debt. About Eleanor's voice in her ear for 3 years. About the morning she understood exactly what the POA documents were and signed her name anyway, telling herself it was temporary, that I would never know. I listened completely without interruption. When she finished, her hands were shaking and her eyes were red, and she was waiting for a verdict she believed she deserved. "I forgive you," I said. "Completely. As your father." Her shoulders shook once hard. Then that chin came up the way it always had since she was 12, steadying herself with the only tool she had ever fully trusted. "But I'm not coming back to Clearfield Drive," I said. "Not because I'm angry, because some things, once they've shown you what they are, don't go back to what they were." She nodded. She did not argue. That told me more than anything she had said. I covered her hand with mine and held it. After she left, I stood in front of Margaret's photograph. The Tuesday morning one. Blue robe coffee mug against her cheek. "The light is better in this room," I told her. I pressed 2 fingers against the frame. Then I went to find Daniel, who was in Raymond's garage, naming every tool on the pegboard wall in the serious voice of a boy who believes that knowing the names of things is the first step toward understanding how they work. He was not wrong about much. I am not a man who tells his story easily. For 71 years, I believed patience was the same as strength. What I learned is that patience without boundaries is not strength. It is an invitation written in a language that only the wrong people know how to read. Do not wait as long as I did. If the people you love have learned to treat your kindness as a resource rather than a gift, that is not a reflection of your worth. It is a reflection of what you allowed. I allowed too much. I say that without self-pity, only as a man who finally understands the difference between loving someone and disappearing for them. This is what I believe about family justice. It does not arrive loudly. It arrives the way good light arrives low, specific, illuminating exactly what is real. These dad's revenge stories are never truly about revenge. They are about a man deciding at last that he is worth protecting. God does not waste what a man is willing to fight for honestly. Family justice. Dad's revenge stories. The truth, when you are patient enough to document it, always arrives. If this story stayed with you, drop a comment and tell me which moment hit hardest. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe, because the next story is already waiting, and it will find you at exactly the right moment. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means everything. These stories contain fictional elements crafted for reflection and education. If this is not the content for you, no judgment, find what speaks to you. But if you stayed this far, something in this story found you for a reason. And that reason is yours to keep.